start, I'd like to say a few words about Ipieca. Ipieca was originally established in 1974 at the request of the UN Environment to develop a shared industry response to environmental and social issues and a platform to share knowledge and best practice. Our role with the UN and others is not to lobby, but to act as a constructive partner. We inform our members of key developments, make fact-based information available globally, build relationships, and explore partnerships. We are the only global association covering both upstream and downstream activities. Our membership operates worldwide, and we reach about 500 oil and gas companies when we include our association members. Ipieca has been active on the topic of methane for a number of years. We have run methane-related workshops in the past, produced a methane glossary, and shared our work on our methane mapping initiative via a webinar. This information is readily available on our website. Also, we work collaboratively with other organisations such as the Methane Guiding Principles, OGCI and IOGP, as you'll see as we go through the workshop. And now a few words on housekeeping. We are using Teams as a platform to help with interactivity. The webinar is being recorded and will be available in a few days. A link will be provided to those who requested the on-demand option at the registration. Please keep your microphone on mute and switch off your camera unless you are presenting. This helps preserve bandwidth. We have a dedicated Q&A spot within each session. So please use the raise hand function, and we will use this to help moderate the questions. There's also the chat function if other questions come up. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I will not go through the agenda in detail. Suffice it to say, we split the 2 hours into 4 sections, examine different aspects of methane. The scene with the science, looking at regulatory regimes and then existing voluntary initiatives, and finally discussing global expectations for the oil and gas sector. We have a wide range of excellent speakers and hope that you enjoy this virtual workshop. Next slide. Just a quick reminder of the antitrust guidelines. You should all be familiar with these, but they do bear this reminder. I'll let you read through them briefly. Next slide. Our first speaker is Marielle Saunois of the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin. Apologies for the pronunciation. To Marielle and the other presenters, my colleague Jack will move the slides when you request. We hope this is easier than each presenter having to share and unshare their screens as we go along. Next slide, please. I'll hand over to you, Marielle, and let you introduce yourself. Marielle.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. I will thank first the organization committee for inviting me to participate and to present Methane and do this first talk. So my name is Marielle Saunois. I'm an assistant professor at Université de Versailles-Saint-Quentin, and I work at the Laboratoire of the Laboratory of Climate and Environmental Science in France. So I will present you the methane science through the global methane budget that covers the last 2 decades. And this global methane budget is an international project. You have the core team that is explained here, but it involves hundreds of people around the world. Next slide, please. So just to go through a bit of the history of methane over the last 2,000 years, here I show you the methane concentration. And you can see that before the pre-industry, methane concentration in the atmosphere were about 730 ppb. And it has increased quite rapidly due to human activities, and have reached in 2019 about 1,875 ppb. So methane concentration have been multiplied by about 2.5 since the pre-industrial era. Next slide, please. So, as you all know, methane is the second most important greenhouse gas that contributes to human-induced climate change. On the left, I show you the contribution of the different greenhouse gas to the additional greenhouse effect. And you can see that methane contributes about 15% of each after CO2. But methane is also important because it contributes to production of tropospheric ozone, which is also a greenhouse gas, but also a pollutant that harms human health, food production, and ecosystems. And thirdly, methane also leads to production of water vapor in the stratosphere through chemical reaction. And as water vapor is the first greenhouse gas, being natural, however the first, it enhances also global warming indirectly through water vapor. So methane has an atmospheric lifetime of about 10 years, which make it a good target for climate change mitigations because reducing methane emission will have an impact, a more rapid impact on the greenhouse gas effect than CO2. So next, please, because I think I forgot animation. Yeah, thank you. So generally, we use a metric called the global warming potential, which is GWP. And usually we use these metrics over a 100-year horizon. So it's GWP 100 year. And this global warming potential is calculated relative to CO2. And for methane, it has been calculated to be 28. So it means that 1 kilogram of methane can trap 28 more times heat than 1 kilogram of CO2 over a 100-year period. However, methane being a 10-year, having a 10-year lifetime, if we do the same calculation, but only over 20 years, then the global warming potential of methane is 84. So next slide, please. So methane as a greenhouse gas contributes to anthropogenic emission of greenhouse gas, and these anthropogenic emissions need to be calculated based on the same metrics for all the gases, and usually we use the GWP 100 year. If we use these metrics, then methane contributes about 16% of greenhouse gas emission over the world presently. Next slide, please. If we now concentrate on the past decades, so here I show you the methane concentration from the 80s. This is when we started to have continuous measurements of methane concentration in the atmosphere through surface stations. So you can see that on the top you have the methane concentration, on the bottom you have the methane growth rates over the past 4 decades. So you can see that in the 80s and the 90s, the increase of methane was quite steady, and it was followed by a plateau between 2000 and 2006. And then methane concentration increased again in 2007. So the increase of methane in the atmosphere is not just a simple steady increase. It has some variation that we try to understand. And these variations reflect the methane sources and sinks budget and the variations of the sources and sinks. So if we want to understand and to project the methane concentration variations, we need to well understand the sources and sinks of methane. Next slide, please. So methane has really many sources and can be produced through 3 types of process. The first one is called biogenic methane, which is methane that is produced through the decomposition of organic matter, essentially anaerobic conditions. The second one is thermogenic methane that has been produced under geological time, under high heat and pressure conditions. And the third one is pyrogenic methane that is due to the incomplete combustion of biomass or other organic matters. And below these three types of production of methane, you can see that there are different sources that I try to organize. With this, you can see that some are natural in green and others are anthropogenic in red. And for example, if you look at the biogenic methane, under this, there is water-saturated soils, you can see that methane can be formed through natural ecosystem, in natural ecosystem, but also in anthropogenic ecosystems such as ripe paddies. If we consider thermogenic methane, there is methane emitted by natural geological gas heaps, but this emission is enhanced due to fossil fuel extraction and also transport, storage, and distribution. So methane emissions are various, and you can see that they are point on diffuse, natural, and anthropogenics. But also some of them are climate sensitive, meaning that they are dependent of temperature, but also precipitation. For example, for wetlands. And this is something that you cannot see, but that I illustrate just after, is that those sources often overlap. Next slide, please. In this slide, I present the distribution of the main source of methane. And you can see that if you consider, for example, wetland and agricultures, those methane emissions overlap in many regions, especially in Africa, Asia, or South America. And wetland also overlap with fossil fuel extraction regions, and for example, in Siberia. So when we use atmospheric observation to try to estimate methane sources, it's quite difficult to disentangle the different sources as they overlap often in many regions. Next slide, please. Regarding the sinks of methane, there are quite of them, but the main one is methane destruction in the troposphere by chemical reaction involving what we called hydroxyl radical, OH. And you can see the number for this sink, which has a large range, and meaning that the sink of methane is quite open. It's difficult to measure OH, which has a lifetime of 1 second, and we need to use models to simulate OH, but those models have large uncertainties. Next slide, please. So there are different tools and data that we use to estimate the methane budget. So global is in bracket because they can be used at different scales. On this slide, you can see in orange, it's representing on the left the anthropogenic emissions. Then you have the natural emission in green, and in yellow, what we do for the sink. So for the anthropogenic emission, which are mainly fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste activities, and biomass and biofuel burnings, there are different global and regional inventories that can be used, and that sometimes relies on national reportings. And there is also some satellite-based inventories that are able to estimate the burnt areas involved in the biomass burning methane emissions. For natural emissions, it's more difficult, and we have to use what we call land surface models that are able to simulate the different processes that are emitting methane, and especially for wetlands. And for other emissions, we often use upscaling of some local measurements based on parameterization and knowledge of, for example, the surface area of lakes, rivers, etc. And for the natural things, As I said, it involves hundreds of chemical reactions, and we need to use what we call chemistry climate models in order to simulate the concentration of the different gas, and especially OH, to estimate methane destruction in the atmosphere. There is a methane sink at the surface that is called soil uptake. And to estimate this soil uptake, we also use land surface models that simulate the processes at the surface. So these different tools are what we call bottom-up approaches, and because they start from the process and they estimate methane emissions. And by combining these different bottom-up estimates, we are able to establish a bottom-up budget. But you can see that these estimates are done for individual sources or sector, and that the total of the emission are not constrained by what we know from the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So there is a different way to estimate the methane budget. It's what we call top-down approaches. So these top-down approach are based on a chemistry transport model. It's what you have in the middle. So this chemistry transport model is using a prior knowledge of fluxes of methane emission and sinks that are based on bottom-up estimates that I just showed. And using this prior knowledge, the chemistry transport model is able to simulate methane concentrations. And then we use atmospheric observation, either from the ground at the surface station or from satellite, to compare these observations with our simulations. And then the discrepancy between our simulation and the observation is reduced by statistically optimizing the methane fluxes in order to have the best match between the observation and the simulations, and the fluxes that allow the best match is used to estimate the methane top-down budget. So using these kind of tools is nice because the total is constrained by what we know from the atmosphere, what is observed in the atmosphere, but such models are mainly able to resolve the net fluxes, and they have quite difficulties to disentangle the different sectors because, as I said, they overlap, and also some regions are not well covered by ground-based stations, so it's more difficult to constrain those regions. So the satellite data can help to overcome this issue because we do have a global coverage, except in the over the pole. But then the precision of the data are less than for ground-based stations. Next slide, please. So using these two approach, we have proposed what we call the global methane budget. So we have estimates for the different sectors. It's what you can see here. On the left, you have the bottom-up approaches. On the right, you have the top-down approaches over each arrows. And you can see that for anthropogenic emissions in orange, the bottom-up and top-down agree quite well, which is not the case for natural emissions, and especially for other natural emissions, where the discrepancy between the two approaches are very, very large. And there is also quite a large uncertainty in methane chemical sinks. However, anthropogenic emissions contribute about 60% of total methane emission over the world. Next slide, please. If we look now only at anthropogenic emissions by sectors, so this is only based on a single inventory, global inventory. However, it shows nicely that the first emitting sector of methane is agriculture, contributing about half of total anthropogenic emissions, and followed by fossil fuel with 25%, then the waste sector that contributes to 20%. However, these relative contributions are really depending on the region that we are considering. Next slide, please. Here you have, for different regions, the sectorial contribution in methane emissions. So you can see that on the left is the first emitter is China, with about 70 teragram per year. And that for China, agriculture and fossil fuel contribute about the same, but it is not the case for all the regions. For most of the region, agriculture is the main emitter. For example, South Asia, Brazil, Southwest America. But for other regions such as Middle East, USA, or Russia, it's the extraction and distribution of fossil fuel energy that contributes the most to methane emission. Next slide, please. And if we are looking at fossil fuel emissions, the regions are not on the same, are not sorted the same. If we look at fossil fuel emission, for most of the regions, the main contributing sector is the oil and gas sectors, except for China and Asia, for which it's the coal sector that contributes the most. Next slide, please. Finally, we also have done some calculation about the changes in methane emissions between the beginning of the 2000s and 2017, which is the last years of our inventories. And so here I show you these changes between these two periods for different regions and for the world, which is the right middle panel, and different box plots. In green, you have the wetlands. In brown, you have the fossil fuel. In blue, the agriculture and waste sector. In red, the biomass burning. And both for the top-down and the bottom-up approaches. So you can see that globally, the increase is mainly from anthropogenic emissions and equally from agriculture and waste and the fossil fuel sectors. But this is not the same picture for different regions. So fossil fuel emissions have increased in China, North America, USA, Africa and Asia, while agriculture and waste emission increase mostly in Africa, Southern Asia and South America. You can also notice that emission decrease in Europe from both fossil fuel and agriculture and waste sectors. And it is the single regions to show such a decrease. Next slide, please. So this is my concluding remarks on the methane science. Atmospheric methane concentration are rising faster over the last decades than in the beginning of the 2000s. And, it's upside down. Since 2013, the trend in atmospheric methane concentration is closer to the most greenhouse gas intensive scenario of IPCC. It's what you should be able to see on the right panel, where you have the observation in black and the different IR5 projection of methane concentration. And you can see that observed methane concentration are closer to the red projection than to the other. So anthropogenic sources are responsible also for all or most of the recent rapid rise in methane global concentration, and equally from agriculture and fossil fuel sources. However, it's difficult to investigate the role of the methane sinks because there is a large uncertainty in OH burden and variations over time. And to conclude, methane mitigation offers rapid climate benefits and economic, health, and agricultural co-benefits that are highly complementary to CO2 mitigation. And I will conclude that there are room to do so by sectors and depending on the region we are considering. Thank you.
Marielle, excellent. Thank you for that really fascinating overview. We're running a little bit behind time, so there is an option to take a question or two now. I don't see any hands raised. It may be that we're taking the science as read.
Yes, there's one.
Is there one good? I just have to pan down. Well, whoever it is, whilst I'm trying to find who you are, I apologise. Please go ahead.
Sorry, it's Sana here.
Oh,
so
hi, Sana.
Yeah, thank you for that great presentation. I got two questions, and you can take one, maybe. First one was on the plateauing concentrations on one of your charts in the period, I think it was 2000 to 2006, where it looked like things were flat. Can you explain a little bit about what may have happened, or the uncertainty around why we can't say what was happened? And the other question related to the OH radical that you talked about, and why there's such a big uncertainty and how that could be improved maybe with some of the algorithms and computer models. Thank you.
Okay, so for the first question is about the plateau. So the plateau is mean that methane concentration have been stabilized over a few years. It means that at some point sources equal the sinks, and it could be due to different regions. There's no really consensus in the community. It could be considering that anthropogenic emissions still continue to increase at that period. I don't see any reason why it has decreased or stabilized. It could be due to a decrease in natural emissions, specifically from wetlands, which contribute a lot to natural emissions, and also to an increase in the methane sink, so an increase in OH concentration. And increasing the methane sink will balance the increase in methane emissions, and so that we could have constant methane concentration in the atmosphere. So it's the two possibility. One, it's either one of them or both of them could have contribute to the plateau. The next one about OH is that so the chemistry climate models do not specifically consider. They do not have the same climate, so they have quite bias. They have some biases in temperature, water vapor, etc., that are important for OH production in the model, and they are using some chemical reactions, and the chemical scheme can vary from one model to another. So that also explains the differences between the chemistry climate estimates of methane sink. There could be some improvement. It's on the way, but it's quite difficult to disentangle the reason of the discrepancy between the chemistry climate model.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marielle. Again, in the interest of time, I propose that
Sure.
we move forward to the second session, which is an update on current regulations. I just realized I had my camera on, so if those of you who were seeing me looking at my phone, it's because we do have a last-minute change to one of our presenters. So our second session is on regulations. We have three regional updates, one from Canada, Ian Kurohawa from the Alberta Energy Regulator, followed by the United States with Angela Zivkovic speaking on behalf of the API. And the third one is Brendan Devlin sends his apologies. He is stuck on a train. So James Kneebone from the DG Energy has kindly offered at the very last minute to stand in for him. So thank you, James. So we'll move on to Ian Kurohawa. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah. So I'm an emission advisor on the emission management team at the Alberta Energy Regulator, or the AER. So the AER is the regulator in the province for the oil and gas and coal production and processing industry. We're the only regulator, and Alberta is the largest hydrocarbon producing province in Canada. And Canada is the third largest oil producing region by reserves, I believe, in the world. So since 2016, the AER has had a mandate to reduce methane emissions by 45%. And our target year is 2025, and 45% is our target. Our baseline year is 2014. So if you advance the slide, please. I'll spare you the monotony of actually getting into the nitty-gritty details of the regulation that we've created, but it's in Directive 60, so one of the regulatory instruments that we use to regulate flaring and venting and incineration in the upstream gas industry in Section 8. If you're curious ever to take a look, I encourage you. So I'll give an overview of kind of the main points of the regulation, and then you can either look for yourself or reach out to me afterwards if you're interested in learning more. So we started with clear definitions. I think this is a really important point that sets a good foundation for the regulation. Things like routine venting or non-routine venting, there's a lot of activities in the upstream oil and gas industry that can kind of straddle that gray line between routine and non-routine, and so setting clear definitions is really important. And as well, we've gone ahead and defined the difference between fugitive and vent. Fugitive being unintentional and vent being intentional. That isn't necessarily consistent throughout most of the, sorry, someone might not be on mute, so make sure you're all on mute. Sorry, yeah, so fugitive and vent might not be consistent throughout all the jurisdictions in the world or all the literature or materials that you look up. And so defining what is fugitive versus vent is another important aspect because we use those different mechanisms to regulate differently. So for venting, we have strategic vent limits. There's kind of like a hierarchy. Directive 60 regulates by sites. And so at a site, there's an overall vent gas limit at the top, and then routine vent gas limit, which is sort of nested within the overall vent gas limit and quite a bit more stringent than the overall vent gas limit. And then there's equipment-specific limits as well on venting for compressor seals, pneumatic devices, and glycol dehydrators. Those equipment-specific regulations are split into new versus existing as well. So new devices or equipment that are installed or relocated after 2022 have much more stringent requirements than those that were existing prior to 2022. Some of them are even basically no venting going forward from 2022 onwards. For fugitive emissions, we have risk-informed fugitive survey requirements, frequencies, sorry. So 3 times a year for high-risk facilities, 1 time a year for non-high-risk facilities, and then screening once a year for well sites with no other infrastructure on site. We also have a mechanism in the requirement for flexibility. So the operators can apply for an alternative fugitive emission management program. Typically there we're looking for innovation. So remote sensing technologies is the main sort of mechanism for innovation, I think, right now in this space. And so we allow for that and encourage that within our regulation as well. There's an annual reporting requirement. So we get categorized data, and it's sort of a bottom-up approach using the vernacular that's become popular, meaning operators have to go out and do inventories of all their equipment and count all the emitting sources and then either do estimates or measurements from the bottom up to create an annual report for all their facilities. And then there's a regulatory review going forward periodically. So in 2022 will be our next one where we can kind of take stock of where we are in terms of our trajectory towards the target and either increase or decrease the stringency as appropriate. So next slide, please. Quick few lessons learned based on where we are. So the regulation went into effect Jan 1, 2020. So it's been in effect here 11 months or so. So, we're not there yet, but we have some lessons learned so far. The carrot and stick approach is what I call what's happened on the pneumatic device front here in Alberta. The carrot being an offset protocol that's existed since 2016 and applies to the Alberta offset system. So operators can change their pneumatic devices early according to the regulations timelines. So before 2022 2, and they can generate emission offsets that are applicable to compliance requirements or compliance obligations. And we've seen great uptake in the last few years under this protocol. Over 970,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emission reductions have been registered on the offset registry. And we see that increasing in the later years since 2016. And so we anticipate millions of tons of emission reductions associated with pneumatic device changeouts that are early to the regulation. And we anticipate really good compliance with that aspect of the regulation as well as a result of this sort of carrot and stick, with of course the regulation being the stick. As I mentioned, annual methane reports are required, and so 2019 has been reported in the 2020 year. So we got the reports from last year. We have over 30,000 reports, and we have quite a bit of data that we're parsing through right now. I think going forward, the data will be really important for us to be able to understand where we are in our trajectory and the trends on the different categorizations. On remote detection, we've done 2 campaigns, so 2 sort of major campaigns, I would say, for the AER's scale. Dozens of flights, and over 8,000 sites have been surveyed with the aerial remote detection technologies. 288 square kilometers that have been surveyed with satellites, so commercially available satellites right now, sort of the point and shoot style. Tropomi data has been used since 2018 to help us select and triage areas, and we've driven over 7,000 kilometers with vehicle-mounted sensors. All these technologies, I think, are coming to maturity and that they have shown value, and I think that's an important point worth noting here. The space is commercially competitive right now, and there's value propositions, real value propositions for regulators like the AER and others around the world. And I think a lot of these technologies have good complementary attributes that work well with what we would do normally is methane site inspections. And that's the last bullet. So we've worked pretty hard to get an inspection program up in 2020. We've started the inspections. We're pretty delayed as a result of COVID, but with some tweaks to the program and some careful social distancing, we're able to do these site inspections, hundreds of site inspections now. And we're starting to see some really interesting results. I'd say the biggest challenge for industry in this first year is on the reporting side. So as I mentioned, getting all that equipment inventoried and then getting appropriate estimates or measurements for it all is a really heavy lift in this first year. And so we're seeing some discrepancies and working through those with industry in the years to come and making sure that they're compliant with the reporting requirements as well as the reduction requirements. So next slide. So that's it. There's some contact information up there or places where you can find more information if you're interested. And if you're interested in contacting me directly, I think you can reach out to the organizers, and I think I'd be happy to have my contact information shared with you guys. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian, and many thanks for putting up some lessons learned that we can maybe pick up on a bit later. So now, next slide, please, Jack. We go to our second speaker in this session, which is Angela Zivkovic from speaking on behalf of the API, talking about the US. So Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Angela Zivkovic, a regulatory policy advisor with Occidental, and I will be presenting on behalf of the American Petroleum Institute. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has regulated new and modified emission sources from the oil and gas industry, specifically since 2012, although gas plants were regulated prior to the 2012 oil and gas specific rules. And there are a number of other regulations that have been implemented through the years that could apply to emission sources in the oil and gas sector, like engines and dehydration units. I'll just be focusing on the oil and gas specific regulations today. In addition to these federal regulations, states have implemented their own oil and gas rules, and I'll discuss those briefly at the end as well. Next slide, please. So since 2012, the scope of the original rule was to control emission sources at well sites, compressor stations, and gas plants. The rule that was finalized specifically listed volatile organic compounds as a regulated pollutant. The Environmental Protection Agency determines control standards based on a cost effectiveness equation, where they're looking at the cost of implementing the emission control against the potential emission reductions. As a result of their analysis, the 2012 rule regulated gas well completions, pneumatic controllers, storage vessels, compressors, and fugitives from gas plants. Many of the emission source control requirements do not have a de minimis VOC threshold, and methane emissions are reduced as a co-benefit to the VOC controls. Reduced emissions completions are required for gas wells, which requires that gas is captured once separation is possible. If the gas cannot be sent to a gas gathering line, it has to be sent to an emissions combustion device. High bleed natural gas driven pneumatic controllers can no longer be installed, and instead low bleed or intermittent natural gas driven controllers or other non-emitting devices are required for any new installations. And gas plants are required to have pneumatic controllers that are not driven by natural gas. Any storage vessels that are greater than 6 tons per year of the VOCs is required to be controlled. And there are requirements for both reciprocal and centrifugal compressor engines. Reciprocal compressor engines are required to change out rod packing at a set frequency, and the centrifugal compressor engines are required to capture and combust emissions. And lastly, there are strict leak detection and repair requirements for gas plants within that 2012 rule. In 2016, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, revised the 2012 rule, and they expanded the scope to regulate VOCs and methane from well sites, compressor stations, and gas plants. The transmission and storage sector was also added during this rulemaking. After the cost effectiveness analysis was completed, the completions for oil wells were required to be controlled, as well as pneumatic pumps and leak detection and repair for well sites and compressor stations were all emission sources in the 2012 regulation. The same standards for gas well completions now also apply for the oil well completions, and pneumatic pumps are required to be controlled. Gas plants are required to have pneumatics that are not driven by natural gas. Optical gas imaging cameras are required to perform leak detection and repair inspections. Well sites perform inspections semi-annually, and the 2016 rule required quarterly inspection frequencies at compressor stations. In addition to these new source performance standards and all the emission controls in there, in 2016, requirements for existing sources were established for areas that exceed national ambient air quality standards for ozone levels. And the Environmental Protection Agency has a set of guidelines for these existing sources of VOCs that largely mirror the 2016 new source performance standards. So as a co-benefit, methane is being reduced at these existing sources through this rule. Lastly, at the federal level, this year in 2020, the Environmental Protection Agency finalized a new version of the rule that went back to regulating only VOCs from well sites, compressor stations, and gas plants. The transmission sector was removed when methane was removed as a regulated pollutant, but control standards for all other sources were maintained. Other than changing the regulated pollutant, the frequency of the leak detection and repair inspection frequency for compressor stations went from quarterly to semi-annual, and low production wells were exempted from the leak detection and repair requirements. Other changes were largely technical amendments within the rule. Similar to the 2012 rule, methane emissions, although not directly regulated, are reduced as a co-benefit to the VOC emission controls. There are active legal challenges to the rule, so this may change. Next slide, please. Now I'll briefly touch on the state rules. So all of the US states must comply with Environmental Protection Agency rules as a minimum requirement, but US states have the authority to implement their own regulations, and 9 states have adopted additional regulations or permit requirements that meet or exceed the federal new source performance standard requirements. Of the 21 oil-producing states, 5 of the top oil and gas-producing states have regulations that meet or exceed the Environmental Protection Agency standards. and additional states have proposed regulations to implement new requirements or to increase the stringency of current regulations. So this is constantly in motion, and new regulations or changes are being finalized. As well as standards for new sources. Some of these states that I've mentioned have regulations for existing emission sources as well. And that concludes my portion. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Really appreciative. It seems like there is a lot going on in the US, even as we speak. The third section is the EU methane strategy. I think I mentioned in the opening that Brendan Devlin was not able to make it at that time. Although, Brendan, I see that you're now on the call. So I'll hand over to either Brendan or James to take us through the EU methane strategy.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Apologies, yes. Brendan's not been able to make a strong enough connection to be able to present, but yeah, hopefully you can keep an ear on it, and if I say something I shouldn't, he can he can interject or write a correction. Also, we're joined by colleagues Dagmara Koska and Dinko Raychev as well. And you know, if there are any gaps in the presentation, then please feel free to write any detailed questions, and we can absolutely get back to you. So if you could just move on to the next slide. Thanks very much. We already had quite a detailed overview. I caught the end of Marielle's presentation about the science, so I think we can cover this slide and probably the next one we can skip through. This covers sort of the overall background of motivations, but we all understand well that the subject matter, I think, here. So also this slide you can move past. One thing that was really interesting that Marielle mentioned, which was part of the motivation for the strategy, was although yes, it's true that emissions in the EU are declining, there are significant emissions associated with the imports of fuels consumed in the EU as a major importer of fossil fuels, and that's one of the things this strategy looks to address. So in this slide here, you see some dots which are indicative of significant methane emission sources around the world associated with fossil fuel production, transportation, and use. So it gives an indication of some of the key areas that we want to look at through the whole supply chain of the EU's fuel consumption, and not only the emissions emitted in the EU itself. Next slide, please. Yeah, similarly, this slide gives a similar indication of the differentiation between the level of emissions inside the EU and outside. So although, again, as we see emissions declining in the EU, that doesn't mean to say that our work is done. And there's definitely a significant amount of emissions associated with the fuels consumed. Next slide, please. So why a methane strategy? Well, first and foremost, the EU does have reduction targets for 2030 for all greenhouse gases, with anthropogenic methane emissions covered by a national emission reduction target under the effort sharing regulation. But currently there are no specific policy dedicated to the reduction of anthropogenic methane emissions. And therefore, the strategy released by the EU on the 14th of October, which hopefully some of you have been able to see, it looks to address that. And yeah, in line with the EU's 2030 climate goals, as well as wider international targets. Next slide, please. So this looks at a few of the key initiatives of the strategy. It's a cross-sectoral strategy, so it covers energy, but also waste and agriculture. There's a key priority on improving measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions, as well as leak detection and repair for known emission sources, so really to improve the level of data and then to address emissions that are well known and understood. The EU envisages regulations and legislation in the next year on MRV and LDAR. There's currently a roadmap being developed with that in mind, so there will be an accompanying impact assessment to assess the different tools that could be put in place for such an initiative. So the specifics of it are not exactly known at this moment, but the impact assessment will be done to assess those. And that can be expected probably towards the end of next year. There's also going to be a review of current EU climate legislation, so that would include the emissions trading system, the effort sharing regulation. Those are to be reviewed in 2021, as well as a consideration of revising other key pieces of regulation, including the Industrial Emissions Directive, which may have its scope included to include certain other agricultural emissions, as well as the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Register, and regulation on the Zero Pollution Action Plan and the NECs to take account of that. Another key initiative also outlined in the strategy regards the establishment of an international methane emissions observatory, which will look to utilize satellite data such as what we saw in the previous slides from the IEA to verify the emissions data that we received, the bottom-up data from companies on the ground. So that's really an information-specific platform, and that will be developed in collaboration with other key international partners, including UNEP and the IEA, the CCAC, including the Scientific Advisory Panel. Yeah, and then the final point here about targeted support for biogas from organic waste residues. That's again about trying to minimize emissions in the waste and the agriculture sector through sort of a synergist relationship with energy production at the same time. More detail on that in the strategy. So if we could move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So yeah, as I mentioned, there will be legislation on MRV and LDAR to come in the following year. As well, there's a consideration, and potentially even part of that impact assessment will be about the viability to impose legislation on potentially eliminating routine venting and flaring throughout the energy supply chains. But again, an impact assessment will be required, and as a priority, combustion efficiency is being looked at, possibly under the scope of LDAR as well. That's really something that we're looking at in detail. On the side of coal, there's some good examples of best practices in the EU, such as in countries like France and Germany, where there are already regulatory frameworks to facilitate the utilization and the mitigation of coal mine methane. But the EU is looking to do a lot more on that. And there's already some reports that have been done that we've looked at, commissioned by DG Energy, to look into ways to minimizing coal sector methane. It's a key issue in the EU, and that may come under the wider scope of work being done under coal regions and transition. So yeah, more to come in that area. Next slide, please. And then finally, the international action. So as I say, a key priority is to address emissions outside the EU's borders associated with fuels consumed within the EU. And that will involve a range of collaboration approaches. So I already mentioned work with the IEA, with the UNEP, who I think are speaking slightly later. And as well, one specific action is to secure a pathway of events and actions leading to potentially a resolution in the UN General Assembly in 2021. Just really about driving and coordinating global action on methane. So, you know, the specificities of that are to be decided, and Dagmara could give you more information on that as well. But yeah, that's really to try and drive international coordinated action, and there'll be a series, as I say, of key events leading up to that next year. I guess I've run already a little bit over time, but if I could just say on the International Observatory, another key action is to try and provide transparency on the emissions associated with supply chains. So what we call a methane supply index in the strategy is a sort of transparency tool we hope to be developed under the scope of the observatory to give consumers an indication of emissions associated with different supply chains leading to the EU. And yeah, next slide. I think that's everything. Apologies if it's a little bit fast and a little bit just on the surface. If you have more detailed questions, please feel free to get in touch.
James, thank you for that and for standing in at such short notice. You did an excellent job. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Very briefly, one question, and then we'll go on to our next session. One question did come up, and I think it's for Ian Kuwahara, which is, could you please define routine venting?
Yeah, good question. So it's a tricky one. I think there's a lot of activities that kind of straddle that line, as I might have mentioned in my presentation. So routine venting would be continuous. I think we call it continuous or intermittent intentional. So by design. But if something relieves pressure and vents to the atmosphere every day, for example, that would be an intermittent and therefore routine vent. Non-routine would be things like upsets and emergencies, things that sort of have to happen for safety practices. So yeah, does that answer the question?
The question was from Brigitte Poot, so I hope that covers it, Brigitte.
Hope so. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Perfect.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone. So our third session was around voluntary initiatives. And we have 3 presentations, one on the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0 from Manfredi, from UNEP, the MGP, the Methane Guiding Principles with Rebecca Middleton from the MGP, and then the Environmental Partnership, and Matt Todd of the API will talk to the Environmental Partnership. And if you're on the line, Sonna, I think as an Ipieca member, we had someone to set the scene, which was just to say a few words to open this session. So are you there, Sonna?
Yes, I am, Jim. Thank you.
Great. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, so you'll be glad to know I'm not going to talk through the slide that's in front, but it just shows you the context that, as we've heard with the previous presentations, there's lots going on in this space. If we were talking 5, 6, 7 years ago, there would have been very few initiatives going on. And what we've seen in the recent years, a plethora of initiatives. There's different initiatives in different parts of the world or with different stakeholders, but they are serving different purposes. We're also seeing those initiatives made up of industry, but including also regulators, NGOs, and other stakeholders. And they're adapting and changing, and they're moving, moving much more towards delivery. And the 3 examples that Jim has referred to that we'll hear from shortly are just examples. They're not the only ones out there, but they're 3 that we have highlighted as interesting ones to learn from and see how they're developing. And that's what we hope to get out of this session here. That was all I was going to add, Jim.
That's great. Thank you, Sonna. And I should have mentioned in my opening remarks that we're glad that we have Sonna as our chair of the Methane Task Force of Ipieca. So thank you to Sonna and for the task force in general for helping us put together this virtual workshop. So now, if you go to the next slide, please, hand over to Manfredi from UNEP to talk about the OGMP 2.0. Manfredi.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to present the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership to this audience. And indeed, it is our pleasure to be able to do so, given the ambition that we think we have achieved with the participation of many of the companies that are on the line and their leadership, of course. So if we could move to the next slide. Jim, the work of UNEP in the oil and gas, on methane from the oil and gas sector is largely in the framework of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. UNEP is currently managing 3 streams, one on transparency, that it's indeed the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, one on science, many of your companies are participating in the methane science studies, and one stream on policy that looks at including promoting the inclusion of methane reduction targets in countries NDC before COP26 next year in Glasgow. But focusing on the OGMP, and if we go to the next slides, the OGMP started in 2014, so it's one of the few that would pass the history test that Sonna was mentioning earlier. It was launched in 2014 at the UN Secretary General Climate Summit, largely pushed in the framework of the Climate and Cleaner Coalition by the UK, Norway, and US governments. And that saw the participation of only upstream companies, and 10, 12 of those, as you can see at the bottom of the slide. It was really, well, it is one of the few methane emission partnership that is truly multi-stakeholders, in the sense that includes governments, international organizations, non-governmental organization, and indeed, and critically, oil and gas companies. And initially, in its first phase, was very focused on mitigation, so on highlighting the efforts that these leading companies in the early age of more general interest about methane emissions were placing to manage their emission and highlight the mitigation performances that they had achieved. Over the years, including thanks to the leadership of industry in this sector, more and more institutional organizations have been born, including the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, the Methane Guiding Principle, from which we're going to be hearing later, and that UNEP is happily a member of. And we thought that together with the companies participating in the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership and the European Union, that in the meanwhile had joined the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, to redesign it, to make it as ambitious as the time required, both in terms of public opinion, but also in terms of understanding of the importance of methane towards the climate system. So if we can go to the next slide, we spent the last 18 months redesigning entirely the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership and bringing it to what is now called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. That we believe is the new gold standard of methane reporting. It covers not only upstream operations, but also mid and downstream operations. It doesn't cover only operated assets, but critically non-operated assets. It covers all material sources, not only the 9 core sources that the OGMP was focused on, and critically, it covers incomplete combustion from flaring that we believe is one of the major underlooked sources of methane. And it defines a performance target, the reduction targets that is indeed left at the liberty of the companies, of the participating companies. We hope will be periodically reviewed and made more ambitious, but also that the OGMP will be able, through the reporting that the companies will be submitting, to make sure that this target is indeed achieved. So if we move to the next slide, we're gonna we have defined 5 levels of accuracy that companies will be reporting emission following the methodology of, and it's basically an increased level of ambition. We start at level 1, that is basically the companies give us a number and we trust it, to what we call the gold standard, that is a suitable combination of level 4, 5. The details are actually being worked out as we speak in a number of task forces, together with in which companies, NGOs, IGOs, and governments are represented. But that implies a combination of bottom-up and top-down measurement and reconciliation of those two set of measurements. And companies have agreed to reach this suitable combination of level 4, 5 in 3 years for operated assets and 5 years for non-operated assets. If we can go to the next slides, this translates into reporting emission at gold standard, so a level 4, 5 in 2024 for operated assets based on 2023 data, and in 2026 based on 2025 data for non-operated assets. That is quite an ambitious pathway, considering that some of these companies have a long way to go to increase the accuracy of their emission measurements. Next slide, please. We're gonna have a significant increase in the number of companies that will be joining us in the OGMP 2.0. They will be presented on November 23rd in an event jointly hosted by the EU Energy Commissioner and UNEP Executive Director. We have had an increase of 600% from 10 to over 60 companies. You can see some of those here in the slide, and we're discussing with additional one that we hope to be able to bring at the launch of November 23rd. We're indeed welcoming any inquiries by any of you on the call, and we'll be glad to discuss with you how you can join the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. And with I think I have the last two slides. I'll go very quickly with this. If we can move to the next one, Jim. And a couple of clicks, if you don't mind, and two more. So just to say that thank you very much. That given the focus of the OGMP to not only operated but also non-operated assets, we have increased the zone of commitment from 15 to 30%, and we have increased our zone of influence to up to 50% of the oil and gas production. So quite a significant increase compared to the OGMP 1, and an additional source of confidential asset level very that will allow us, Jim, if we move to the next slide, to include several sources of data as part of our work on the International Methane Emission Observatory that James referred to in his previous presentation. The work of the International Methane Emission Observatory that will be launched in 2021 in UNEP and in collaboration with the IEA and the Climate and Cleaner Coalition, as mentioned, is going to be on the one hand to challenge and corroborate the company reports using independent observation to field measurement, satellite data, as more and more satellite come online and their ability to be accurate and reliable increases. Is going to update core methodologies to measure and quantify methane emissions, so to increase the accuracy of methane emission estimates. Is going to publish company reports, not with obviously the confidential information, but with information that are aggregated by company. But also critically is going to is going to track their progress against the targets that have been made public by the company themselves. And then finally, we're also going to provide technical support and knowledge to help them better manage methane emissions and hopefully reduce them. In advantage, to promote a significant reduction of methane emissions in line with the ambition that we're going to discuss later in the afternoon. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion and to any question if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfredi, and we'll hear from you a little bit later. And can I say I do like your background, so much appreciated. Just one question, Manfredi, if I may. You mentioned the event on the 23rd of November. Is that kind of a virtual event that people are free to join? And if so, would it be okay if we shared the joining details or registration details?
Yeah, absolutely. It will be a virtual event. It will be open to the public and certainly open to disinterested public. And so as soon as I'm able to do so, I will share additional information, Jim, for you to further disseminate it to the Ipieca members that we will certainly welcome.
That's perfect. Thank you, Manfredi. And now if we could move to the methane guiding principles, and Rebecca Middleton. Over to you, Bex.
Hi, thanks, Jim. So I will give a very quick through the methane guiding principles because I know we're behind time. So I'm Rebecca Middleton, the program manager. If we could just move to the next slide. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the methane guiding principles, we're a voluntary initiative. It's an international initiative with members across upstream, midstream and downstream industry, and also importantly with non-industry organizations as well. And our focus is for priority action along the natural gas supply chain. Next slide, please. So the initiative was started in 2017. We focus our activity around 5 key principles, and these I'll come on to those in the next slide. But as I mentioned, these principles are supported through activity by our signatories. So those are the companies that can actually do something actively to reduce their own methane emissions, and also through our supporting organisations who support us through their expertise and their advocacy activity. Next slide. So 5 principles I mentioned. I won't talk through them all. Sufficient to say that our work plan is shaped by these 5 principles. Next slide. So our members have a number of expectations when they join. Firstly, most importantly, the signatory companies must commit to progressing those 5 principles and report publicly on how they're meeting the intent of the methane guiding principles. And then we ask that each signatory and supporting organisation support at least one project every year. And that support can come through financial support and or they can give it their time in running a particular project. And then any outputs from the projects are reported publicly. And you can go to our website if you want to find out some more. Next slide. So we have 23 signatories. Our newest signatory here, Novatech, based in Russia. And we also have a further, if you can move to the next slide, 16 supporting organisations there as well. And obviously we have a number of people from all our member companies and supporting organisations on this call today. Next slide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available through the MGP website. So firstly, we have 10 best practice guides, each focus on a specific area of methane management. And 2 of those guides were released just in the past couple of months. And thanks to BP and others that were involved in development of those. Good news is that we are also translating these guides into a number of different languages. So they're already available now in Mandarin. And by the end of the year, we will have French, Spanish, Arabic and Russian versions available too. We also have a methane cost model available through our website. So this is a screening tool that people can use to evaluate different mitigation options and work out the cost benefit of those. And then finally, we have a gap assessment tool So again, allowing an organisation just to get a baseline overview of where they currently sit with regard to methane management. Next slide, please. Some of the initiatives that have been going on this year. So we have a global outreach program. So this is essentially 2 different training courses that are available. One is a 3-hour executive course that is obviously aimed at giving a high-level overview of methane and its importance and some areas of focus. And then a full-day masterclass course, which goes into much more detail and includes some really good case studies. Obviously, we've had to modify this given COVID, so these courses are now available through virtual delivery, and there is an e-learning under development as well. So if anyone wants more information on those courses, do get in touch. We have some flyers that we can send out. We also, some of the MGP companies work together to develop a set of recommendations ahead of the release of the EU strategy, and advocacy and work in that area is going to continue into next year. Other work that's ongoing, we are looking, some of our companies are working together to look at how to influence NOJVs and work with NOJVs successfully to reduce methane emissions in non-operated sites. And then the MGP part funds the updates to the IEA methane tracker as well. And then a couple of other initiatives that have gone on in October that I wanted to mention. One is going on in Malaysia, where Petronas are working together with Shell, Exxon and Repsol, who all operate in Malaysia, to share best practice and to highlight some of the gaps and challenges faced by operators in meeting the MGP expectations in Malaysia. And a really successful roundtable was held in October, where there was some great dialogue and good discussion between operators, which was good to see. And then the other, very quickly, the other activity that went on is that there was a Chinese release event for those best practices I mentioned when they were released in Mandarin. There were some keynote speeches, and the EDF, Beijing Gas and Shell all helped to make that release event really successful. And what was interesting is that our MGP website saw a spike in access from China following that event. Next slide, please. So then finally, just some contact details here. If anyone does want to get in touch and find out more, then please do so. Thank you.
Excellent, and thank you, Rebecca. Just a brief question, if I may. You mentioned the flyer for the 2 courses, the masterclass and the executive outreach. Mm-hmm. Would you be okay if we were able to share that with the participants? Changing culture is an important thing to do, and hitting the right part of an organisation to get them thinking more about methane is clearly a very good strategy and initiative. So if you could share that flyer with us, then we could share it with the participants.
That would be my pleasure.
Excellent, thank you. In this section here, we have one more speaker. Is Matt Todd of the American Petroleum Institute to talk about the environmental partnership. And then we'll take a couple of questions. I can see some in the chat box. So don't forget, you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question in the Q&A for this session. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all and tell you about the environmental partnership. Again, I'll try to go through these slides quickly, get us a little bit, save you a little time here in the end. So next slide. So the environmental partnership is US-based. It's a coalition of oil and gas production companies and transmission companies. And at the highest level, this is the mission of our program, is to continuously improve the industry's environmental performance by doing three things: taking action, learning about best practices and technologies, and fostering collaboration in order to responsibly develop our nation's oil and gas resources. So next slide. Just to speak a little bit more about these three key principles of the environmental partnership. For taking action, the companies that are participating in the program are implementing environmental performance programs that we've created that we believe are cost effective, they're commercially proven, and they achieve significant emission reductions. On the learning component, we're really trying to use the environmental partnership to foster that operator-to-operator information sharing. So we do that through hosting workshops across the United States in major oil and gas basins. And finally, we're also trying to use the environmental partnership to be a hub, really foster the dialogue and information sharing among all of the different stakeholder groups as well. Either that's sharing information on new academic research or program learnings from our program, new technology developments that are occurring here, across the industry to further reduce methane emissions from our operations. Next slide. We launched the environmental partnership at the very end of 2017, so we have a couple of years under our belt. This program, again, it's administered by the American Petroleum Institute. You do not have to be an API member to participate in the environmental partnership. So you can see we've been very focused on recruitment since the launch of the program. We started with 26 companies participating. We now have 85 companies that are participating today. We have 36 of the top 40 U.S. Natural gas producers that are participating in the program. You can see on the left there, this program is being implemented across all of the major oil and gas basins across the United States. Next slide. It's a list there of the companies that are participating. I'd just like to make a note here. We have very diverse participation across the industry. We have some of the smallest companies that are implementing, and drilling their first oil and gas wells that have recognized the value of participating in the environmental partnership from the very start. And obviously, we have some of the largest oil and gas companies participating in the program as well. And again, operating all across the United States in every major oil and gas basin. Next slide. You can flip to the next slide. So on taking action, what are the companies doing to reduce emissions? Again, the focus of this program at the outset has really been to reduce air emissions. And when we talk about air emissions, we're talking about both methane as greenhouse gas and VOCs as a precursor to ozone from our operations in the US. So we've relied heavily on the Environmental Protection Agency's greenhouse gas reporting program for emissions data to really hone in on the highest emitting sources within operations. So you can see the bullet list there. We focused on equipment leaks, high bleed gas-driven pneumatic controllers, liquids unloading, compressor leaks, and pipeline blowdowns. So next slide. So these are the environmental performance programs that the companies are implementing in their operations to best suit their unique. So they're going out and finding and repairing leaks, either using optical gas imaging cameras or portable analyzers or some equivalent technology. They're phasing out the use of high bleed gas-driven controllers. They're implementing a best practice to minimize emissions associated with the manual liquid unloading events. And a couple new programs that we actually created that companies are implementing this year. They're reducing emissions from both centrifugal and reciprocating compressors, and they're also implementing practices to minimize emissions associated with pipeline blowdowns. So those are two new programs that we've expanded the coverage of the program to cover also the transmission, so gathering, boosting, and transmission sources to address emissions from compressors and pipeline blowdowns. Next slide. So the companies to join the environmental partnership have to agree to implement the environmental performance programs that we've created, but they also agree to do annual reporting so we can really track the progress for this program from year to year. Annual reporting is due in the spring of each year, and really we created this program to evolve over time. So the information that we get in from each year's annual reporting, we can make any modifications we need to the existing programs, or like we've done for the creation of the compressor and pipeline blowdown programs, to expand the program to address even different segments across the supply chain. We take all of the reporting and aggregate that, and then we roll that into our annual report to really track progress from year to year. So next slide. This is an example from our leak detection and repair program, what the companies implemented in 2019. This represents participation from 69 companies in 2019. So our leak detection and repair program, you see more than 87,000 sites were surveyed. There were more than 184,000 surveys that were conducted at those sites. Each of the companies estimate the number of fugitive emission components. You know, these are valves, flanges, etc., that have the potential to leak. So more than 116 million component inspections were performed in 2019. And you can see from the participating companies, you know, good operations, they're finding that less than one fugitive emission component was leaking out of 1,000 components. Next slide. These are for the data that came in from our pneumatic controller and liquid unloading programs. Out of the 69 companies, you can see many of the companies have had very aggressive programs internally to phase out the use of high bleed gas-driven pneumatic controllers. So you can see 43 of those companies no longer have these high bleed controllers in their operations. Last year, there were more than 3,300 high bleed controllers that were phased out of operations. And this is an example where we have actually changed the program to capture the other efforts within the company. So the 10,500 are actually other gas-driven type controllers that the companies recognize. We're taking these actions. These are positive reductions, you know, for the program, and so wanting to capture that in the reporting. It's more than 10,500 either intermittent or continuous low bleed controllers were replaced or removed from service. And more than 2,800 zero emitting controllers were actually installed in 2019 among the participating companies. Finally, more than 44,000 gas well liquid unloading events were monitored, and by monitoring those events and minimizing the duration, the companies that are participating in that program are further reducing emissions from their operations. Next slide. You can flip to the next slide. So again, on the learning component, we're really trying to foster that dialogue from operator to operator. So in a normal year, we would be taking the environmental partnership across the United States and host, you know, face-to-face workshops. We have done that in previous years. Obviously, this year we were unable to do that. We did squeeze in one final workshop in March of 2020. That was in Midland for the Permian operators. We've been there essentially every year. Again, I think, you know, that workshop was focused on flaring. So it's an example that, you know, the program has the capacity and the flexibility to really focus on emission sources or any issues that the companies are facing to really foster that dialogue on other issues. So in March of 2020 in Midland, we did focus on flaring. So that was really trying to promote what are the practices that companies are taking to further reduce, you know, emissions, flared volumes of associated gas in their operations, or also ensure good combustion, et cetera, for when flaring does occur. So we have the opportunity to really focus on other emission sources as well, and we did that in Midland earlier this year. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So again, we're trying to use the environmental partnership as really a hub for these communications and interactions and collaboration with other stakeholder groups. Normally we do that in our annual conference Last year we were in Houston. We're hoping to get back to Houston again next year for the 2021 annual conference. So that's an ongoing annual opportunity for us to bring in other stakeholder groups and hear from them on either, it's a regulatory community or folks that are developing new technologies to advance, emission detection technologies, etc. So that's an important component of this program. We're trying to foster that through our annual conference. Next slide. Finally, for folks that are, I imagine many of you are familiar with the work that's occurring at Colorado State University. Dan Zimmerly there leads his METEC facility. So this is a mock well site that they have at Colorado State University. Since the start of the environmental partnership, we've really identified, the work and detection testing that they're doing at Colorado State University is really aligned with the mission of the program. So we've tried to foster the efforts there that Dan has at METEC, and we've provided some funding to help them secure also a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy. So we're hoping to continue to foster that collaboration, and Dan's doing a lot of great work out there testing new detection technologies, and we're hoping to be a part of that collaboration going forward to try to take some of those new technologies and get them into the field and play a role through the environmental partnership to provide sites for some of that testing going forward. Next slide. Jim, I think that's my final slide there. Certainly welcome questions, and if folks, if we can't get to them today, please reach out to us. The annual report's available on our website, and again, please, happy to be here and have the opportunity to tell you about the environmental partnership quickly, and welcome any questions now. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Matt. Great overview. If I could, I guess there's a couple of questions that link the regulatory section with the voluntary initiative section. And the question that I have is, you mentioned the environmental performance programs of the environmental partnership. And if a participating company follows and implements those, to what extent will they be in line with both the federal and the state level regulations? I assume they will at least meet them and probably be in advance or above them.
Yeah, that's right. There is a lot of overlap. Obviously, the work that we've implemented these programs, both leak detection and repair. Obviously, the intent of the environmental partnership or for the companies that are participating go above and beyond the regulatory requirements and expand it, through their operations. So that's an important component. But there is very good overlap in the sources, if you recall from the presentation from Angela earlier. Where companies have to do leak detection and repair, where they can no longer, use high bleed gas-driven controllers, etc. So we're really trying to, both advance the regulatory requirements and get those beyond just where they're required to implement those programs from regulatory programs, and also identify the other cost-effective actions where. Say, for example, the gas well liquid unloading practice is a good opportunity. They're not maybe a regulatory requirement in the United States, but it's something where the companies that participate in this program are going above and beyond. So that's certainly important for the environmental partnership to continue to promote those, common sense actions that will further reduce emissions from our operations.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. And then one more question before we move on to the final section. And that's one for Manfredi. So if you can get ready to unmute. That is it's a question from Rebecca. How much are regulators looking to align with each other and OGMP 2.0 on reporting requirements?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. We should really ask the regulators how much they're willing to do so. I'm not able to speculate on their behalf, but from our side, there's certainly an interest in facilitating a discussion among regulators for them to, well, first of all, understand how the OGMP works and what kind of data they will be able to have together with the analysis of the International Methane Emission Observatory. So we think there is a lot of potential for collaboration across national regulators and international voluntary initiatives Indeed, the regulators have law on and regulations that play in their for their benefits, I guess. So again, from our side, they're our best intention for having this dialogue and facilitating this discussion. Then how much they're going to be willing to do so, we should ask them.
Thank you, Manfredi. Very diplomatic. We now come to our fourth session about setting global expectations. We've heard about the science, we've heard about current regulations, we've heard about voluntary initiatives that may go beyond the regulations. But often society expects more and will continue to expect more. So in our final session, we have three excellent speakers. Firstly, Julien Perez of OGCI to talk about targets. Then Manfredi again from UNEP to talk about expectations. And finally, Adam Pacey of Chevron to share with us some learning opportunities that his company has gone through in this whole area. And if we have time, we'll finish with some Q&As. But if I can ask you all to be brief and then hand over to Julien.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks a lot to all of you for welcoming us. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, and of course, very happy to catch up after the meeting or during the Q&A. So if you can move on to the next slide, just a very quick recap of what OGCI is for those of you who are not yet familiar with the organization. So we've been launched back in September 2014 as a coalition of companies wanted to be additional to what each of its members was doing on the climate change, as well as being additional to what the market was offering. So the idea was really to play the role of a catalyst of low carbon solution alongside the energy value chain. So focusing on oil and gas, but also expanding the outreach to other sectors. And this initiative is led by the CEOs of the 12 current member companies and aims again at being accelerating the solution to support the achievement of the Paris Agreement's goals. So you could see that we have focused our efforts on the hard to scale up solutions, and because of this mandate that we have to be additional, being CCUS to transport and mainly the heavy duty vehicle or the marine transport, natural climate solutions, etc. But as we spoke today, indeed, actually also the methane challenge and what we call the role of gas, so the red square that you can see on the slide. In addition to this coalition of companies that are defined at the top of this slide, we have also set up an initiative back in 2017, which is the Climate Investment, which is a shared 1 billion plus investment fund that is taking equity share into startups that echoes the topics that I've mentioned just before. So taking equity and in solutions that are innovative in methane space in particular, but as well in transport and CCUS, etc. And then we support the deployment of those technologies among our member, but as well outside of our membership. If you move on to the next slide, the way we've defined our work program since our inception, methane has always been very high in our agenda. And the way we've defined our work is to, starting from a point that has been widely described by the previous speaker, that there is a high level of uncertainty associated with the methane sources and the need to increase this by tackling three challenges that OGCI and the rest of the oil and gas industry need to rapidly overcome. One is about the increase of transparency and data accuracy. The second one is about demonstrate mitigation action. And the third one is about having a wider impact outside of the membership of OGCI, so expand outreach to have an influence on the rest of the oil and gas value chain. So I'm going to focus on the box number 2 here, which is again the three buckets have a lot of actions within the OGCI, but I'm going to focus on the box number 2, so demonstrate mitigation action and zoom on the targets. So if you move on to the next slide, as part of those actions, you can see that some of the actions that are ongoing or on our plan going ahead. One is the work that we're doing with IOGP and Ipieca to identify the best practices when it comes to detection. So using some assessment of how those technologies can be used depending on the site characteristic. Also working on a compendium of methane technology, and we do that, of course, in close collaboration with the methane guiding principles. Defining our methane intensity target, and I will expand that a little bit. We launched it in 2018, and we have made some significant progress toward the achievement of our targets. Supporting the aim, of course, of the zero routine flaring by 2030, and we support, for instance, also work that is conducted by the Penn Institute and the World Bank to source and map the gas flaring globally using satellite data. We're working as well on defining internal KPIs to track detection campaigns and potentially disclose that after all, and have an extended outreach about it. Manfredi talked about the UNEP Global Methane Alliance. We are very as well as engaging with governments and external stakeholders to help them in defining methane targets in their NDCs, as well as a number of existing ongoing partnerships that we have with SPE, Ipieca, IOGP, etc., again, to share knowledge and to make the science progress. So it's very much oriented to actions, collective actions, and demonstration of the results that we achieve. And if you move on to the next slide, that's going to be my last slide. This is just a highlight of the methane target. So as you can see, we started to baseline in 2017 with an ambition to reach a reduction of 1/3, so from 0.30 to 0.20 by 2025. This is an intensity. So that aggregates upstream methane emission from gas and oil operation divided by the gas that is reaching the market. So in 2019, we're at 0.23, so we're in good shape to reach our ambition level. And we work now to improve we continue to work to improve the quality of the data, but as well as improving potentially the level of ambition that we look ahead after 2025. And we also gonna share information and knowledge with partners to see how we can expand the outreach and the impact of it outside of the operated domain. Saying that, of course, we have a number of other actions, but I'm very happy to elaborate furthermore during the Q&A or after the meeting, just not to take too much time. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Julien. And now it's Manfredi, part two. Manfredi from UNEP, with expectations for target setting in the oil and gas industry. So over to you, Manfredi.
Thank you, Jim. I'll try to be short. Nice talking to you again this afternoon, everyone. So if we can move to the next slide. This gives me the opportunity also to respond to or to comment on a question that more and more often we get asked, and it is, why would the UN Environment Program work with the oil and gas industry? And you know, this is the reason why we're doing it. So I hope to be able to provide our perspective. So UNEP is indeed supporting government, has an objective to be able to support government achieving the Paris Agreement targets. Every one of us and everyone on the call is certainly aware of Article 2 that calls for the global average temperature to be well below 2 degrees centigrade and to pursue effort to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Less well known is Article 4.1 of the same Paris Agreement, and if we can move to the next slide, we're gonna have a presentation of it. That really calls for the reaching of a peak of emission. Jim, to the next slide, please. Peaking of emission as soon as possible, but also to reach a net balance between anthropogenic emission and sinks in the second half of this century. This in reality means different things. If you're looking at a 1.5 degrees world or a 2 degrees world, the net zero in the first case for CO2 should be reached by the middle of the century, with an overall GHG balance by sometimes in the second half of 2050 or in the early part of 2070s. While for the 2 degrees target, we would have a little more time with net zero emission of CO2 by mid 2070 and the net zero GHG overall towards the end of the century. So how are we doing? And if we can move to the next slide, this is a slide of one of the major reports by UNEP, that is the UNEP emission gap report, the 2020 version of which is going to be out in the next weeks. So watch that space. Jim, if you could click like 3 or 4 times, we're gonna see here. I think that's it. Yeah, one more. Thank you. So we see that even with the best, well, through the commitments that country has taken in their NDCs, both in the unconditional or the conditional scenario, we're really far from the 2 degree centigrade range, and even further from the 1.5 degree target. We can move to the next slide. We can see that the difference is between 13 and 15 gigaton to 29 to 32 gigaton in case of the 1.5 degree scenario. So quite a significant gap between what the science tells us we need to be and where the current trajectory and commitments are taking us. So there is no doubt that there is need to increase the ambition, and we believe that methane emission from the oil and gas sector can be an extraordinary tool in the short term to reduce this gap and to reduce these emissions. So if we can move to the next slide. These are graphs from the 2020 World Energy Outlook published by the IEA. We can see how there is a huge potential for methane reduction in both oil and natural gas operations. We can see how important non-operated assets are for both the majors and with the specific OGCI companies, and how much of this potential reduction that in the Sustainable Development Scenario, the IEA calls for 40% reduction by 2030. This would be, for a large part, methane in the case of oil, and almost entirely methane in the case of natural gas. So there is certainly a need for increasing action. The IEA called for an analysis of the IEA and mentioned that 75% of the reduction of methane emission reduction in the oil and gas sector are technically feasible. A little bit over 40% would be achievable at zero net cost, according to the analysis. But if we were to be reaching the 75% reduction by 2030, we would be able to decrease the global emission gap by between 6 to 15%, depending on whether we're looking at the 1.5 or 2 degree scenario. So it's a very significant piece of the gap we're trying to fill, and one of it that is really cost effective and in which technology and finance are largely available to the actors that control the emissions, so the industry itself. If we can move to the next slide. It is so in terms of ambition, it is not UNEP ambition, this is the IPCC ambition in terms of where methane emissions should be going by 2030. So we are calling for a reduction that is between 60 and 75% reduction, so in line with what the IEA considers technically feasible. If companies decide for an absolute reduction, and if they choose for an intensity base, it should be equal or minor to 0.2%, as we have seen from OGCI companies. These can be achieved. Should be both operated and non-operated assets. We have seen before how much of the potential for reduction lies in non-operated assets of the major international oil companies. Should be based on real measurements and should be verifiable. It is unfortunately clear that to have a good estimate of methane emissions, it is necessary to measure them. It is not enough to just use emission factors that are typically not related to the geography where they are applied, and should be done fast. So this is again a near-term opportunity that the world has that we should not miss, but target to be for 2030 and possibly with an interim target at 2025 to show progress and to show movement in the right direction. If we can go to the next slide, and I'll try to be short here. This is a slide from Drew Schindel, from the chief of the chairman of the scientific advisory panel of the Climate and Cleaner Coalition. It's a little old, it's from 2012, but gives an idea of the importance of methane action, but how much methane won't be enough to bring us to the 1.5 or 2 degree target. So we need an holistic approach that covers indeed methane, that covers CO2, that cover black carbon, to be able to have a shot to reach the target that the nations of the world have agreed to in Paris. If we move to the next slide, we see the UNEP has started publishing, together with a number of partners, a production gap report in 2019. This is also going to be updated in the next weeks. With a specific focus on COVID, not surprisingly. But the analysis of the production gap report show that the world is on track to produce over 50% more fossil fuel by 2030, that would be consistent with the 2 degree pathways, and even 100% more than would be consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. So it is crucial that in addition to methane, and again, we're very much encouraged by the leadership that some of the companies are showing on methane. It is important that the methane is one step, but not the only step. And if we can move to the last slide, is yet again a slide from the WEO, the IEA WEO 2020. That shows how much of current energy production that covered by fossil fuels could be then covered through different means. And we see how in the net zero scenario, that is a new scenario the IEA started to publish this year, the reduction is even more clear in both oil, gas, and coal. Already in 2030. So it is important that companies realize, and we're sure to see more and more companies taking 2050 commitments. Today, the last one being Equinor, that we certainly commend for their leadership. But it is important from our perspective, from UNEP perspective, that methane is a step, is a first step, that more and more companies would take ambitious action on methane, but also to realize that the ambition cannot stop at methane, but needs to continue in the years to come towards CO2. So thank you very much, as usual, and as usual, happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Manfredi. Our final speaker in this section is Adam Pacey of Chevron. And Adam, you have about 5 minutes, if that's okay. I guess you knew this would happen, being on last in such a packed agenda, but I'll hand over to you. Take it away,
Thanks,
Adam.
Jim. I just wanted to, since there are a lot of other operators in the call, go through the experience that Chevron has had with having a methane metric for the last couple of years and talk with you all about some of the lessons learned in this area. So next slide. So we have three action areas for the energy transition focus that we have, and I'm putting these up on the slides, not necessarily to talk about them all in depth, but to sort of show you that when we're looking at methane intensity reduction targets and other greenhouse gas reduction targets, it's part of a much larger effort of things that we're doing. So one of our action focus areas is to lower the carbon intensity cost efficiently of our operations. And this includes upstream greenhouse gas reduction targets. We've taken a base year of 2016 and looking to complete these by 2023, so short to medium term targets, depending on your definitions and timelines. And for methane in particular, we have a 20 to 25% intensity reduction target over that time period. Next slide, please. So as part of this goal to lower our carbon intensity cost efficiently, we have these 4 targets that we showed in the previous slide for oil net intensity, gas net intensity, flaring intensity, and methane intensity. We've taken a little bit of a different approach on the basis compared to some of our peers in this space, in that we've taken an equity view. So this includes both Chevron's portion of operated assets as well as non-operated NOJVs inside the frame of that target. We've chosen sort of the base year and the stock take years to align with the timeline for the Paris Agreement. So as countries are starting to do their stock takes, we'll be doing similar approaches. A couple of other unique features that we think are value adding, including performance on these metrics being tied to the annual variable compensation of 100% of executives and nearly all employees. Next slide. As you can imagine, with any target and external disclosure, there's a variety of different communication methods that are needed to talk about and inform stakeholders about both your progress and your goals in the space. We have a number of different reports that we release externally on different timelines. It includes our sustainability report and website. There's a really nice feature this year for the sustainability website in particular, where all of our metrics and greenhouse gas data have some nice charting and graphing features to sort of show progress to different stakeholders and make accessing that data a lot easier. We periodically publish different reports on climate risk and resiliency, and pieces of our metrics have shown up in those reports. And given the tie to compensation, we do put information on our performance in our annual proxy statement as well. Next slide. Sorry for going through those first couple pretty quickly, but I wanted to kind of spend the bulk of the time talking about the lessons learned we've had. If there's other operators in the call that are considering methane-related metrics, and some of the things we've learned along the way that you all may find useful. I think one of the key things we've done is to align the process of developing these metrics with the larger business planning process for the corporation. It's really been helpful in terms of planning and aligning expectations. One of the interesting pieces is, since we do this on an equity basis, the same production denominator you see with financial reporting, things like the annual reports or different financial metrics that we have, the same denominator is being used in our emission intensity reporting. I think that's the unique piece about the equity, including the NOJV emissions, that I think is really powerful and allows broader discussions with different stakeholders using the same sets of both numerators and denominators. The piece I probably didn't personally appreciate as much at the start of this process in terms of the impact it would have was the tie to compensation for nearly all employees. What that's done is it's really created a shared sort of goal and environment from people around the company, and had some really good ideas being brought forward from different people around the company based on their roles and their local situations in different business units. So I think it's really tied some of the corporate goals that we have to some of the corporate goals that we've tied into some of the business unit planning processes. There's a couple of other interesting pieces with our metrics. I think we're focusing a lot on taking action today and the things that taking action on what we know about. I think that's been a pretty important piece, is that there are things that you know about and can do today to reduce the emission intensity of your operations. I think it's been informed heavily by different data tools that have been developed. So I think a lot of people are doing either different business intelligence softwares, different dashboards, different ways of accessing and displaying data. We found that some of those tools and being able to access emission inventory data to a much broader set of people within the company and to have easier slicing and dicing of data has been really efficient and effective in terms of identifying different reduction opportunities. So I think that's an important differentiator that may be available now that may not have been available a couple of years ago in your organization. And I think the final piece on the methane metrics is that we have our methane metrics are consistent with the other GHG reduction metrics that we have in terms of how we present them to the investment community and to the outside world, that we found to be very powerful in terms of being able to display and talk about these different metrics. So similar, numerators and denominators for methane as for other greenhouse gas reduction goals. Apologies for going through that really quickly, but I think I've hit my kind of 5 minutes, Jim. Happy to talk with it. We'll follow up with somebody later if there are more questions.
Thank you, Adam. That was concise and to the point, and much appreciated. I notice we've hit our time contract to the minute. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. We covered an awful lot in 2 hours, and we knew it would be ambitious, but we do hope you found it all useful. A recording will be made available in a few days, and slides will be available in PDF format. And finally, I'd like to say many thanks to all of the presenters, not just for giving your valuable time, but for showing everyone just how much is going on in the area of methane, how much the oil and gas industry is already doing to manage emissions, but also just how much remains to be done. And finally, I'd like to mention a Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 17, on partnerships and collaboration. And I hope this workshop is a continuing step in the direction of partnerships and collaboration. So thank you all, stay safe and stay well.